The winter of 1939 did not arrive in the Karelian Isthmus as a season. It arrived as a geological cataclysm. By late November, the temperature had already begun its plummet into the lethal depths of the thermometer, stabilizing near -20 degrees Celsius before diving into the paralyzing extremes of -40 in January. This was not merely cold. It was a thermal environment where the fundamental properties of matter began to change. Gun oil turned into a sticky, useless glue. The steel of artillery breeches became brittle as glass, liable to shatter under the stress of firing. Human flesh, if exposed for more than a few minutes, froze white and hard, the cells bursting as the water inside them turned to ice. It was a world stripped of color, sound, and mercy, a monochromatic void of white snow and black pine forests. Into this frozen hell marched the Red Army of the Soviet Union. On November 30th, 1939, Joseph Stalin unleashed a juggernaut of nearly 500,000 men, thousands of tanks, and endless artillery batteries against the small Republic of Finland. The strategic calculus was simple arithmetic. The Soviets possessed overwhelming superiority in every conceivable metric. They had more tanks in a single division than the Finns had in their entire army. They had air superiority that blackened the sky. The invasion was expected to be a victory parade, a Finnish blitzkrieg that would end in Helsinki within 2 weeks. The marching bands of the Leningrad military district were reportedly issued dress uniforms and musical instruments in their supply trucks, ready to play victory songs in the conquered capital. But geography and weather are force multipliers that do not appear on paper manifests. As the Soviet columns, specifically the 9th and 14th Armies, pushed into the region north of Lake Ladoga, they entered a landscape that was actively hostile to mechanized warfare. The region around the Kola River was a nightmare of dense, old-growth taiga forests, frozen swamps, and narrow logging roads. The massive Soviet tank columns, bound to the few passable roads, became stretched out over dozens of miles. Sluggish steel snakes vulnerable to being chopped into pieces. The deep snow rendered off-road maneuver impossible for the heavy armor and the infantry, who lacked skis and winter camouflage. The Soviet soldiers, conscripted from the warmer regions of Ukraine or Central Asia, were dressed in thin, khaki-brown uniforms that stood out against the white snow like targets on a shooting range. They were freezing, terrified, and blind in the dense woods. And in the woods, something was waiting. It was not a force in the traditional military sense. It was a collection of farmers, hunters, and lumberjacks who knew every rock and tree of the Kola region. Among them was a man who would come to define the entire conflict. Simo Häyhä. Born in the municipality of Rautjärvi, Simo was a man of the earth. Standing only 5 feet 3 inches, 160 millimeters tall, he was unassuming, mild-mannered, and quiet. He was a champion marksman of the Civil Guard and a hunter who had spent his life stalking moose and foxes in these very forests. He did not view the winter as an enemy. He viewed it as a tool. When the 6th Company of JR 34, Infantry Regiment 34, dug in along the Kola River, Simo Häyhä did not simply occupy a trench. He began a ritual of predation that would become legendary. He understood that the Soviet doctrine of mass assault relied on command and control. Officers led, soldiers followed. If you removed the officers, the mass became a mob. And so, Simo went to work. He did not fight a war of movement. He fought a war of absolute stillness. He would leave the finish lines before dawn, moving silently on skis, ghosting through the trees to a pre-selected position in no man's land. The position he chose was never random. It was a masterpiece of microengineering. He would dig himself into a snowbank, shaping the hard-packed snow into a fortress that concealed his body entirely. He poured water onto the snow in front of his rifle barrel, allowing it to freeze into a hard, icy crust. This was a critical detail. It prevented the muzzle blast from kicking up a puff of powdery snow, which would have instantly revealed his location to the terrified Soviet observers scanning the tree line. He packed the snow around him to absorb sound. He became a part of the landscape, a lethal geological feature. But his most bizarre and disciplined habit involved his own biology. In temperatures of -40 degrees, the warm, moist air exhaled from human lungs creates a dense, white plume of steam, a beacon that is visible for hundreds of meters in the clear, cold air. To combat this, Simo would keep a mouthful of snow in his mouth while he waited. The melting snow cooled his breath, reducing the temperature differential and eliminating the telltale steam. He would lie there for hours, motionless, his breath cold, his body insulated by layers of wool and white camouflage, waiting for the Soviet columns to make a mistake. And they always did. The Soviet tactics were rigid and suicidal. They advanced in dense waves, urged on by political commissars. They lit fires to keep warm, revealing their positions. They wore their brown uniforms. When they entered Simo's kill zone, typically a range of 150 to 300 meters, the killing began. It was not a frantic firefight. It was a rhythmic, methodical dismantling of the enemy unit. A single, sharp crack would echo through the frozen trees. A Soviet officer, shouting orders, would suddenly drop, a neat hole in his neck or head. There was no muzzle flash, no smoke, just the sound of the shot and the thud of a body. Then silence. Then another crack. A machine gunner would slump over his Maxim gun. Another crack. A radio operator would fall. Panic is contagious. The Soviet soldiers, seeing their leaders die instantly and invisibly, would freeze or dive into the snow. But the snow offered no cover from a hunter who was often elevated or positioned on a flank. Simo would pick them off as they tried to crawl. The psychological impact was far greater than the kinetic one. The red steamroller was halted not by a wall of steel, but by the terror of the invisible. The Soviet troops began to believe they were fighting spirits, not men. They named him Belaya Smrt, the White Death. They shelled the forests blindly. They sent out patrols that never returned. They deployed their own snipers who were found dead with a bullet through their optics. But they could not stop him, because they could not see him. Simo Häyhä had turned the geography of Kola into a weapon, and he was its trigger. To understand the lethality of Simo Häyhä, one must perform a forensic examination of his chosen instrument, the Finnish M28-30. In the high-stakes world of military procurement, the Soviet snipers were issued the Mosin Nagant 9130, equipped with a 3.5x PU optical scope. This was the modern standard. Simo, however, rejected the advanced technology. His fellow officers, and even the armorers, initially questioned this decision. In the era of modern warfare, the optical scope was the mark of the sniper. It offered magnification, light gathering, and precision at long range. To refuse it seemed like an act of stubborn arrogance or peasant simplicity. Why use iron sights when you can see the enemy's buttons? They asked. But Simo's choice was based on a profound, pragmatic understanding of the physics of survival in extreme conditions. He realized that in the specific environment of the Winter War, technology was a trap. The M2830 was a Finnish Civil Guard modification of the Russian Mosin Nagant, but built to a standard of precision that the Soviets could not match. It featured a heavier floating barrel to reduce vibration harmonics, and a specialized two-stage trigger mechanism refined for a crisp break. But its most critical feature for Simo was the iron sights. The standard rear sight was a U-notch, paired with a square post-front sight, guarded by protective ears, giving it the nickname Pistikorva, or spitz-eared dog. Why did Simo prefer this primitive arrangement over a scope? The reasons were tactical, physical, and environmental. First, a scope forces the shooter to raise his head several inches higher to align his eye with the glass. In the flat, coverless terrain of a frozen lake or a snowfield, those few inches were the difference between invisibility and a silhouette. With iron sights, Simo could press his cheek well deep into the stock, keeping his profile almost flush with the snow, presenting a target no larger than a grapefruit to the enemy. This low profile was his primary defense. Second, the cold was the enemy of optics. In temperatures of -40 degrees, the laws of thermodynamics are unforgiving. A warm breath, a drop of sweat, or the heat from a firing chamber could instantly fog the glass of a scope, rendering the sniper blind. Even worse, the contraction of metal and glass at different rates could crack the lenses or shift the zero. Iron sights never fogged, they never cracked, they never lied. Simo trusted steel over glass. Third, and most fatally, a glass lens reflects light. Even in the dim winter sun of Finland, the glint of a scope lens could act as a beacon, revealing the sniper's position to enemy observers miles away. Simo knew that to be seen was to die. By rejecting the scope, he removed the primary signature that killed most snipers. He understood that his greatest advantage was not seeing the enemy perfectly, but remaining perfectly unseen. The M2830 fired the 7.62 53mm cartridge, a round ballistically similar to the Russian 7.62 M54mm, but optimized for accuracy with finished D1XK6 bullets. Simo knew his rifle intimately. He knew its zero at 20 degrees and how it shifted at 40 degrees. He knew how to adjust for the density of the freezing air, which affected the bullet's flight path. Cold air is denser, causing bullets to drop faster. He did not treat the rifle as a tool, but as an extension of his own will, a mechanism for delivering death with mechanical certainty. While Soviet snipers struggled with foggy lenses and frozen adjustment knobs, Simo's iron sights remained clear, simple, and deadly. He had chosen the primitive over the advanced, and in doing so, he had gained the ultimate advantage. The battlefield at Kola was a unique environment that favored the patient, solitary hunter. The terrain was a chaotic mix of dense, old-growth taiga forests, frozen waterways, and rugged hills covered in deep, powdery snow. The days were incredibly short, with only a few hours of gray twilight separating the long, brutally cold nights. This was an environment where massed formations were clumsy, loud, and blind, while a single man could move like a ghost. Simo Häyhä developed a routine that was less like soldiering and more like high-stakes predation. He would leave the finish lines well before dawn, moving on skis to a pre-selected position in no man's land. His preparation of the firing position was a ritual of survival. He would not simply lie down in the snow, he would engineer a micro-fortress. He poured water onto the snow in front of his rifle barrel, allowing it to freeze into a hard crust of ice. This prevented the muzzle blast from kicking up a puff of powdery snow, which would have instantly revealed his location to the terrified Soviet observers scanning the tree line. He packed the snow around him into a hard rampart, not for protection against bullets, but for concealment and stability. He wore layers of white camouflage, a snowsuit over his gray wool uniform, making him indistinguishable from a snowdrift at 10 paces. But his most bizarre and disciplined habit involved his own biology. Simo would keep snow in his mouth while he waited. This was not for hydration. It was to cool his breath. In the freezing air, a cloud of warm vapor from a human mouth was as visible as a smoke signal. By keeping his mouth cold, he eliminated the steam, erasing the final trace of his humanity. He would lie motionless for hours, buried in the snow, waiting for the Soviet columns to appear. When they did, he did not fire wildly. He selected targets with the cold logic of an accountant. Officers first, identifiable by their map cases and gestures. Then, machine gunners. Then, communications men. He dismantled the enemy's command structure bullet by bullet. The distances he engaged at were typically 150 to 300 meters, close enough to ensure a headshot with iron sights, but far enough to remain undetected. At this range, the iron sights were deadly accurate. He did not need magnification, he needed field of view. The open sights allowed him to maintain situational awareness, scanning the entire tree line rather than tunneling his vision through a tube. When he fired, he worked the bolt with a smooth, practiced motion that barely disturbed his camouflage. He collected his spent brass to leave no evidence. He was a phantom, a lethal anomaly in the Soviet advance, proving that one man with a clear plan could halt a battalion. By late December 1939, the Soviet command at Kola realized they were facing a specific, high-value threat. The morale of the Red Army units was collapsing. Soldiers refused to patrol. Sentries were found hiding in their dugouts rather than watching the lines. The political commissars were furious. They demanded action. The Soviets deployed their own countermeasures, escalating the violence in a desperate attempt to kill one man. Their first response was brute force. Artillery saturation. Whenever a Finnish shot was heard, the Soviets would unleash a barrage of mortar and howitzer fire on the suspected area. They churned acres of forest into splintered wood and black craters. Simo, hearing the distant thud of the guns, would simply slide deeper into his hole or retreat to a secondary position, ghosting away before the shells landed. He understood the timing of the artillery. He knew that the heavy guns were slow to adjust. When explosives failed, the Soviets deployed their own elite counter-snipers. These were men trained in the best Soviet schools, equipped with the latest optical scopes and semi-automatic rifles. They were sent into the woods with a single mission: kill the White Death. This became a duel of philosophies. The Soviet snipers relied on their optics to spot Simo. They scanned the tree lines, looking for a shape, a movement. But they were looking for a soldier, and Simo was a part of the landscape. Their scopes, glinting in the weak sun, became their death warrants. Simo would see the flash of glass, the eye of the enemy, and put a bullet through it. He reportedly killed several counter-snipers by shooting them directly through their own scopes, a feat of marksmanship that bordered on the impossible. The Soviets tried everything. They sent out patrols on skis to flush him out. Simo would wait until they were close, then open fire with his secondary weapon, the Suomi KP-31 submachine gun. At close range, the heavy, rapid-fire Suomi was devastating. Simo would mow down the patrol and vanish back into the white void. The failure of the Soviet countermeasures only increased his legend. To the Russian soldiers, he was no longer a man. He was a forest spirit, a vengeful entity of the winter itself that could not be killed by bullets or shells. This psychological terror was as effective as his rifle. It paralyzed the enemy's will to fight, forcing them to cower in their trenches while Simo waited, patient and frozen, for the next head to appear. The legend of Simo Häyhä is often reduced to a cumulative statistic, 505 confirmed kills. But to understand the terrifying reality of his impact, one must examine a single, defining 24-hour period. December 21st, 1939. This date is recorded in Finnish military archives as Simo's Golden Day. On this single day, amidst the shortening twilight of the winter solstice, Häyhä confirmed 25 kills with his rifle. This number defies the standard metrics of sniper warfare, where a single kill can take days of stalking. To achieve 25 kills in roughly 6 hours of daylight requires a rhythm of destruction that is almost industrial. The conditions on December 21st were optimal for the hunter and catastrophic for the prey. The temperature hovered near -20 degrees, warm enough to allow movement, but cold enough to preserve the hard-packed snow. The Soviet 9th and 14th Armies, frustrated by the stalemate, launched a series of probing infantry attacks along the Kola River. They moved in daylight, confident in their numbers. Simo was waiting. He had positioned himself on a slight rise overlooking a key transit corridor, a frozen logging road used by Soviet supply columns and infantry reinforcements. From his snow-packed hideout, Simo operated with the efficiency of a machine. He did not simply shoot, he managed a kill zone. He allowed the point man to pass, waiting for the officers and NCOs in the center of the column. When he opened fire, he did not pause to admire his work. Crack, cycle bolt, crack, cycle bolt. The Soviet soldiers, hearing the shots but seeing no muzzle flash, panicked. They dove into the snow, but the snow offered no cover from an enemy who was elevated and shooting down. Simo picked them off as they tried to crawl. The psychological impact was devastating. A platoon would lose its leadership in seconds, turning an organized advance into a chaotic rout. By the time the sun set at 2 p.m., Simo had single-handedly shattered the cohesion of an entire Soviet company. To the Finns watching through binoculars, it looked like magic. To the Soviets, it was a massacre by a ghost. While history remembers Simo Häyhä for his bolt-action rifle, a forensic analysis of his combat record reveals a second, equally lethal aspect of his warfare: his mastery of the Suomi KP-31 submachine gun. Simo was not a static sniper who only lay in wait. He was a dynamic, mobile predator. When the Soviets stopped advancing and dug in, or when they sent ski patrols to flank the Finnish lines, Simo would leave his heavy rifle behind and take up the Suomi. The Suomi KP-31 was a masterpiece of Finnish engineering, heavy, 4.6 Kuarstr, machined from solid steel and firing the 9mm parabellum round at a rate of 900 rounds per minute. It was controllable, accurate, and virtually indestructible in the cold. Simo treated this weapon not as a spray-and-pray tool, but as a precision instrument for close-quarters ambush. He would ski silently through the deep forests, flanking the Soviet patrols that were hunting him. He used the terrain to close the distance to within 20 or 30 meters. At this range, the White Death changed its nature. He was no longer the invisible sniper. He was a sudden, overwhelming storm of lead. He would unleash short, controlled bursts, sweeping the enemy line. The Soviet conscripts, often armed with long, unwieldy Mosin-Nagant rifles, stood no chance against the volume of fire. Simo is credited with over 200 kills with the submachine gun alone, though these are often not included in the official sniper count of 505, bringing his total potentially over 700. This duality, the patience of the sniper and the aggression of the shock trooper, made him a complete soldier. He dominated the long range with iron sights and the short range with 9mm automatic fire. He was the total master of the winter battlefield. By March 1940, the war had shifted. The Soviet Union, embarrassed by months of failure, reorganized. They brought in massive reinforcements, new heavy artillery, and most critically, they changed their tactics. Instead of reckless infantry charges, they began a methodical, grinding destruction of the Finnish lines using massive artillery saturation. The red steamroller was finally working. The defenders of Kola were exhausted. They had held the line for 3 months against odds of 100 to 1, but they were running out of men and ammunition. Simo Häyhä was exhausted too. He had been fighting daily for nearly 100 days. The constant cold, the lack of sleep, and the immense psychological strain of killing hundreds of men were taking a toll. He had survived near misses from artillery, carpet bombing of his suspected positions, and shrapnel wounds. His uniform was shredded. His face was frostbitten. Yet, he refused to leave the line. He knew that every day he held his sector was a day the Soviets did not break through. The Soviet commanders had placed a massive bounty on his head. They directed entire batteries of howitzers to fire on single tree stumps if they suspected he was behind them. The forest around Kola had been reduced to a lunar landscape of craters and splintered wood. The cover was disappearing. The hunter was losing his forest. The end of Simo Häyhä's war came on March 6, 1940, just 1 week before the peace treaty was signed. The battle was raging in the forests of Ulisma. The Soviets had launched a massive human wave attack supported by heavy mortar fire. Simo was in a forward position, firing his rifle, trying to stem the tide. He had just killed a Soviet soldier when a random, lucky shot found him. It was not a sniper's bullet. It was likely an exploding bullet, potentially an incendiary explosive round meant for anti-material use, fired by a Soviet infantryman. The bullet struck Simo in the lower left jaw. It did not just penetrate, it detonated upon impact with the bone. The force of the explosion shattered his jawbone, tore away his left cheek, and destroyed the lower half of his face. The trauma was catastrophic. He was thrown backward into the snow, choking on blood and bone fragments. A fellow soldier, finding him moments later, famously reported that half his face was missing. He was piled onto a sled with other bodies, presumed dead. He was unconscious, his body cooling rapidly in the snow. But Simo Häyhä did not die. His legendary toughness, forged in the hard life of a Finnish farmer, kept a flicker of life burning. He was evacuated to a field hospital, where surgeons looked at the ruin of his face and despaired. He lay in a coma for a week. On March 13, 1940, the day the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed ending the Winter War, Simo Häyhä awoke. He had lost half his face, but he had outlived the war. He had held the line. The Soviets had taken thousands of square miles of Finnish territory, but they had never taken Kola while Simo was conscious. The White Death had been silenced, but he had not been defeated. The Simo Häyhä, who woke up from a coma on March 13, 1940, was a man physically shattered. The explosive bullet had removed half of his lower jaw, his left cheek, and damaged the structure of his skull. He was unable to speak, unable to eat solid food, and in excruciating pain. The war was over. Finland had retained its independence, but lost 10% of its territory. But Simo's personal battle was just beginning. He was transferred through a series of military hospitals, finally arriving in Helsinki. The reconstructive surgery of 1940 was primitive by modern standards. There were no antibiotics like penicillin available in mass quantities. Infection was a constant, lethal threat. The surgeons faced a daunting task. They had to rebuild a face from bone grafts taken from his hip and skin grafts from his arms. Over the next 14 months, Simo underwent 26 separate operations. Each surgery was an ordeal of pain and slow recovery. During this time, Simo became a symbol. The Finnish government used his image, before the injury, as a propaganda tool to boost morale during the uneasy peace. But the man in the hospital bed was not a hero. He was a patient fighting to regain basic human functions. He had to learn to eat again, to speak again. The damage to his jaw meant his speech would always be slurred, a permanent auditory scar of the war. Yet, throughout this ordeal, medical staff reported that he never complained. He endured the pain with the same stoic, quiet determination that had kept him alive in the snow of Kola. He was not bitter. He was simply enduring. When Simo was finally discharged from the hospital, he returned to a changed world. His family farm in Karelia had been ceded to the Soviet Union as part of the peace treaty. He was a hero without a home. He eventually settled on a small farm in Ruokolahti, deep in the Finnish forests. Here, the deadliest sniper in history did something remarkable. He became a simple farmer again. He rebuilt his life with his own hands. He raised dogs, he bred hunting hounds, and he farmed the land. He did not seek the spotlight. He did not write memoirs or give boastful interviews. He lived alone, a bachelor, surrounded by the forest that had been his battlefield. But he did not leave the gun behind. He became a renowned moose hunter. The locals knew him not as the White Death, but as the man who never missed. Even in peace, Simo used his iron sights. He was frequently invited to shooting competitions. In one famous incident, a visiting dignitary or officer challenged him to hit a target at 150 meters. Simo raised his rifle and hit the bullseye instantly. When asked how he did it, he gave his famous one-word answer, "Practice." This single word encapsulated his entire philosophy. It wasn't magic. It wasn't hatred. It was skill honed by endless repetition. Although Simo lived a quiet life, the shadow of the war never fully left him. He received hate mail and death threats for decades, presumably from Soviet sympathizers or those who could not forgive the toll he had exacted. He kept his blinds drawn and his rifle loaded, a habit from the front. But he did not live in fear. He lived with caution. He became friends with Urho Kekkonen, who would later become the president of Finland. They hunted moose together. Kekkonen respected Simo not just for his war record, but for his integrity and his skill as a woodsman. Simo was a guest of honor at many events, but he always remained in the background, a small, scarred man in a simple suit, uncomfortable with the adulation. The most profound insight into his psyche came late in his life. When an interviewer finally asked him, "Did you feel regret for killing so many people?" Simo's answer was chilling in its simplicity and clarity. "I did what I was told to do as well as I could." There was no hatred in his voice, no bloodlust, but also no apology. He viewed his actions not as murder, but as a job, a necessary, terrible job to protect his home. He had no nightmares. He slept well. This psychological resilience is perhaps as remarkable as his marksmanship. In the decades following the war, the legend of the White Death grew to mythical proportions. Books, comics, and later internet memes turned him into a superhero. They exaggerated his kill count, some claiming 800 plus, invented stories about him using a submachine gun to snipe at 500 meters, and attributed supernatural powers to him. However, forensic historians have worked to separate the man from the myth. The confirmed count of 505 kills, 542 if unconfirmed are added, is based on the diaries of his unit chaplain and company commander, who verified the kills daily. Even if the number is slightly lower or higher, the tactical impact remains undeniable. He didn't just kill soldiers, he killed the momentum of an entire division. The most important part of his legacy is not the number, but the method. Simo proved that in the age of tanks and aircraft, a single infantryman with a rifle could still be a strategic asset. He proved that fieldcraft, the ability to move, hide, and survive, was more important than technology. He defeated the best Soviet snipers not because he had a better gun, but because he was a better hunter. Why did he never use a scope, even after the war? The answer lies in his connection to the rifle. To Simo, a scope was a barrier. It separated the shooter from the environment. It limited peripheral vision. It created a tunnel. Simo wanted to see the wind moving the trees. He wanted to see the birds taking flight. He wanted to be part of the forest. Iron sights allowed him to maintain that connection. Furthermore, his shooting style was instinctive. He shot with both eyes open. A scope requires a deliberate, unnatural focus. Simo shot like he pointed a finger. This is why he was so deadly with the Suomi submachine gun as well. He understood the flow of combat. He didn't aim at a target. He aimed at a space where the target would be. The iron sight, M28-30, is now a holy relic in the Finnish Military Museum in Helsinki. It is a plain, wooden-stocked rifle, unremarkable to the untrained eye. But to those who know, it is the Excalibur of the Winter War. Simo Häyhä lived a long life. He passed away on April 1, 2002, at the age of 96. He died in a veterans' nursing home in Hamina, not far from the Russian border he had defended. Up until his final years, he remained sharp and active. His death marked the end of an era. He was the last of the giants of the Winter War. His funeral was a national event, attended by generals and politicians, but Simo would have likely preferred a quiet burial in the woods. His grave in Ruokolahti is simple, marked by a stone that bears his name and the dates. It does not list his kills. It does not say White Death. It simply remembers a farmer who did his duty. The final after-action report on Simo Häyhä is a lesson in humility for the modern military. In an age of thermal optics, laser rangefinders, and guided bullets, the story of Simo Häyhä reminds us that the most dangerous component of any weapon system is the human mind. He defeated a technological superpower with a bolt-action rifle and a pair of skis. He proved that motivation, the defense of one's home, is a force multiplier that cannot be calculated in a war game. He showed that simplicity is often superior to complexity. And he demonstrated that the true sniper is not a murderer, but a guardian, a man who sits in the cold and the dark so that others may sleep in the warmth. Simo Häyhä was not a killer by nature. He was a hunter by trade. And when the Red Army entered his forest, they ceased to be soldiers and became prey. That is the terrifying, simple truth of the White Death.